What's up, guys? It's John, and I want to first off say the Intellivision does in fact live, and it lives on. For those who may not know what the Intellivision is, for those who are more modern gamers, aren't really familiar with the retro console itself, it is a console that came out in 1979. Actually, as far as the test market goes, really officially released in 1980. Really was supported for about 10 years, up until about 1990. They sold over 3 million units. Pretty successful brand. Of course, it was produced by Mattel, and it was competition with the Atari 2600. Really the first console wars, even prior to the Nintendo and Sega Genesis one, and later in the 90s, over about 10 years later. It did really well, and up until about a year ago, the Intellivision brand was owned by a gentleman named Keith Robinson. I had actually met Keith several times before, got to know him over the years. He was one of our first guests at Game On Expo, our very first year. Very, very nice guy, and I was really sad to hear that he had passed. But one thing interesting through this is that Tommy Tallarico, who is, some of you may know him, may recognize that name. He's a music composer who's done a ton of video game music for classic games. Cool spot to Seventh Guest, among others. Amazing composer and music producer. He also puts in on and produces a show called Video Games Live, which is fantastic. And I read there's a touring, it's basically a touring concert, and they play music, concert music, to video games while they're playing the music. It's just phenomenal. So Tommy's a really smart guy. I've also met him in person, and when I came to just heard recently that Tommy has purchased the Intellivision name, and they plan on releasing a new console. Now Tommy, they haven't really officially announced when this console is going to be released. I read an interview, it's on an interview where he mentioned it won't be this Christmas. It probably won't be even next Christmas, 2018. It'll probably be released sometime in 2020. So we're talking about some time, and one thing he made a comment about, which I think is smart, is he doesn't want to rush a console to the market. He wants to make it right and perfect it. And he made a comment where any game that's going to be released for this console is going to be at least a 7 out of 10 or higher. So he doesn't want any shovelware. He wants to basically bring back the Nintendo stamp of approval, seal of approval for games. So from my understanding, I don't know too much about this console because they haven't really released too much about it. He did mention it's going to be less than $200, which I think is about right. He mentioned the controller's going to be very, very unique, and he kind of alluded that the console is going to be custom at some point. Maybe the faceplates you can interchange. I'm not sure. There is a website. I'll put a link below. They do have a live interview coming up in a couple days, which is interesting. And if you want to sign up for the newsletter, you can be eligible to be one of 100,000 people for an exclusive purchase of this console. But without knowing much about it, it's hard to say how well or how good or bad it's going to sell. So I'm going to reserve my judgment itself, but I do find it interesting that Atari is making a new console, as most of you guys know, and now Intellivision is now back in the game bringing a console. So here we are 30 years plus later, and the console wars is coming back. So I guess it's going to have Intellivision games built into it, classic Intellivision games. It's going to not have a cartridge slot. It's going to be all games are going to be downloaded through Wi-Fi. It is going to have a wireless controller, and so it's going to be kind of like a Steam box where you can just download new indie games. So it's not just classic games. It's going to be new games. I think is their goal to do that. So again, we'll see how that works out for them. I think Tommy is a good guy. I'm really curious. I think if anyone can do it, I think he can. So again, I'm going to reserve a comment. I'm not going to think anything negative about it until I find out more about the system. The Intellivision system itself is pretty revolutionary back when it came out. It was the first 16-bit console, although not really in terms of 16-bit like most of us think about, like Super Nintendo and Genesis 16-bit, but it technically is 16-bit. It was the first console to have downloadable games, where you can actually download games. This is it was way ahead of its time in that. The first console to have sports logoed. Basically, it was licenses from sports, so they had NFL, MLB, etc. That's kind of unique. And so it did a lot of good things when it came out, and pretty revolutionary. So if you don't know much about the Intellivision, I encourage you guys to look into it, because I'm a firm believer, even if you play modern games and aren't into retro, you have to look at the roots. You have to look at where gaming started. And I believe that if it wasn't for the Intellivision when it first came out, games today would be totally different than they are now. But as far as going back to the system, I don't think they have a name quite yet for it. So I encourage you guys to follow them on Facebook and follow them on their website and sign up for the newsletter to find out more about this new Intellivision system. What are you guys' thoughts about this console? I think some people will argue that this is someone who's going in after the brand and trying to use an old brand and trying to basically market towards the older audience. I don't necessarily see a problem with that. I think it's cool. I think it's great that people are reviving a brand, personally an old brand, and trying to keep it alive. And the old saying is Intellivision lives, and certainly in this case, the Intellivision lives on. And I'm glad that it didn't disappear when Keith passed. And I think Keith is probably looking down. He's probably pretty happy what's going on with the Intellivision brand. And another thing I want to mention also as well is several of the people who are teaming up with Tommy to release this console are indeed actually old school Intellivision guys who worked on the original console. I think that's fantastic. So I think it's in good hands. I think it's really interesting. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Please leave a comment. Thank you so much for subscribing. That means the world to me. We'll see you guys soon. Take care. And of course, game on.